I think the key to being successful with data is understanding the very essence of data-driven value generation, which is, very simply put, the more data signals you can bring together, the more you find hidden or latent, unintuitive patterns in your data, the more you can build services or models using that data, the more customer value or customer services you can create, which generate more data for you, through which you gather more data signals, allowing you to build better services and models, generating more data. That's the flywheel of data, right?
Hi, Gerrit. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Hey, Richie. Great to be here.
Excellent. So just to begin with, I want to talk about why you might want to use AI in data tools. So why might you want any AI features inside your data tools?
There's a long list of reasons, actually. One is as much as AI, helps in many other functions. It's a real productivity gain. Code generation and coding is very helpful. For writing the many lines of boilerplate code. Remembering all the syntax or design patterns. That you might not have handy right now, and in the data space. That equally applies. There are data professionals writing a ton of code in SQL and Python, you name it, in what framework. And having the ability to get high quality generation of larger pieces of code is immensely useful. And I think that's one big category, right? And we can translate that actually to many tasks in the data space. It's always the same idea though, right? You make people more productive / help them do their jobs better. And that's kind of the idea of technology all the way along, right? Technology is meant, to facilitate, a certain problem solving, a certain task. And AI is, if you will, one way of doing that, right? If that's, data governance, data exploration, whatever it may be. On the data side, though, there is also another angle to it, which I think is the more interesting one. And that's, as it turns out, humans are really bad in reasoning about data. So, on the one side, there is great books like, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow about all of the biases that each of us carry that, kind of makes us want to look for the data we want to find, rather for, looking across all of the patterns. That's one piece. But the other piece is also there's a genuine limitation in our ability to understand complex pattern and reasoning about that, right? And if you doubt me, right, then I don't know, why is chess hard, right? Why is it hard to multiply 4-digit numbers, in our brain? Because our brains is not made for that. And this is where AI technology is massively helpful, because it kind of takes all of the best practices of good data analysis, right? How do I reason about data? How do I look, for data? How do I present that? And makes that broadly accessible. So, it's on the one side, for professionals, a great productivity gain, great. But on the other side, it genuinely helps us working better with data and using it for all sorts of processes, decisions, products, ideas, to make them truly data-driven versus data validated.
Okay, I like that. So it's a mix of doing technical things like getting the AI to help you write code, but also the maybe slightly less technical stuff and more on the interpretation side of things, and making sure that you're not having any psychological biases in your analyses. Okay, so are these tools are they purely for data teams, or does it go beyond that? Is there anyone else that's going to benefit from AI in data tools?
Yeah, and it needs to go beyond that. And, a tool always needs to make sense, for the person using it, right? So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And the tools for data professionals, they are different, for the like tools for laymen, right? Just take a Formula One steering wheel. Well, I couldn't use it, but I can drive my car every day. So tools need to fit in the context, in the mental model, in the skill level of the person using it. And it means that with AI, we're also going to have a spectrum, right? We're going to have, on the one side, technical tools for technical-oriented people. If you think about the whole idea of code generation, it's really built on the idea that that someone understands the output, right? By definition, this means that this family of tools is made for a highly skilled technical expert. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have people who don't know code, who don't know SQL, who don't know data structures. And in today's world, basically they have two real options, right? One is they ask someone who is, and that's, the usual cycle of, people in a business function, asking a data skilled person to do something for them, and they explain the problem, and that person tries to understand the problem and then tries to do the analysis and then gives them something back. That's one way of doing it. And the other way of doing it is not doing it at all. And the interesting piece, though, is that a very good way of thinking about generative AI is actually how can it be used to scale scarce resources. And data professionals are scarce. They're not in abundance. And what it allows us is what I just described, that when you have a question, that instead of calling one of those few data professionals, you can actually talk to a data agent who is doing the same steps, right? Understanding what you're looking for, doing the analysis and giving it back to you in an understandable form. And this is only built on the idea, right, that you are not leaving your space of competency, right? You're not required to switch to a technical domain. You're not required to see or write code. You're interacting with the AI system like you would interact with an analyst. And so that means that we will have a broad spectrum of AI in data, depending on what the person is, what their context is, and what their level of expertise is.
I like the two options, and I think for many people, the idea of just not working with data at all is maybe appealing, but it's not going to have a great benefit. So back to that first idea of maybe commercial team members interacting with data teams, or it's like a pain because it's slow and there's never enough data people around to answer all your questions. You're suggesting that data people can be replaced by AI. I think this is maybe going to terrify a lot of our audience, the idea that your data scientists are going to be taken over by AI. Your data scientists are going to be taken over by AI. Is that what you're intending? Like that data science can be completely done by AI?
No, I don't think so. And I actually think it's this is not about replacement, because that idea is wholly, I think, built on the idea that basically today, we have one way of doing it, and now it's a better way of doing it. So we're going to replace the one way with the other. I actually think where both you and I started from is the reality that most people don't have access to data and insights. So there is a lot of, if you will, unmet demand. And now what AI creates now for data analysts and data specialists is a whole new way of how they can enable that demand. Because in the past, organizations have tried so many ways, built up centers of excellence, built, so-called, BI people and business teams. But it always was basically built on that idea, build more skill. And now what, data teams can do, they can actually say, I'm going to build, an AI agent for this, right? Because, someone, basically still needs to define, and also in an enterprise context, basically stand for the correctness of that, right? So defining what data to be used, defining, what questions, should and could be asked, defining, the semantics of that. Basically all of that context setting, that's going to be done by data teams. We cannot think of that like, full autopilot. That is way too reductionist. This is, like a kid would imagine it, right? Suddenly we have, this robot coming in and doing all of these things. It's actually, the reality is much more sophisticated, right? We're going to have data professionals, which today are cranking out dashboards, which today are having like this long, request line of people wanting more, basically being able to create, these agent-based analysis spaces, which then people can, freely interact in and do a whole bunch of things they would have, originally, come back to them with, to ask them that, and, have the possibility to focus then on this other category of data problems that you and I talked about, right? The ones that cannot be described in a system like this, that require a data professional. And in the big picture, actually give way more people access. There is way more demand than what we are fulfilling today. So I think it's an amplification.
Okay, I like that. So it's basically churning out the stuff that the data scientists would never quite get round to in the priority list, or maybe reducing the scope of work for them so they can do things more effectively. Now, you mentioned that a lot of data scientists spend way too much time cranking out dashboards. So I'd love to get into how the world of dashboarding is changing. So how does powerful generative AI change what you do with the dashboard?
Dashboards are great, right? And at the same time, they're horrible. So, for one thing, dashboards used to be actually one of the best ways to surface data information, right? And there's a whole, I think, science around, how to visualize data, right? Stephen Hugh, if I remember correctly, and so many others who work in that space. And how do we make data human comprehensible? And we have tools that, then are smart and how they can compose widgets and all of that. But, reality is, again, if you then look into real enterprises, they have thousands, if not tens of thousands of dashboards, which are unused or hardly ever used. Many of them are, one-time explorations, one-time questions, that just got stale. When you look into, real dashboards, they are quite complex. It becomes a complex system in itself. And then, you are largely contingent on the quality of the day, the person of the day, to catch and to act on interesting signals or not. So that's already, I think, telling us, how problematic or how much improvement potential there is still to have, right? Because what you would rather want is, like I said earlier, right? You should not create a dashboard for one-time exploration, right? There should be a way of how you could do this, in a modality that actually people work in. Earlier I said, tools need to fit to the workflow someone is in, right? Even my job is not checking dashboards, right? If you're on email, if you're on chat, if you're on any application, information should find its way there, rather requiring you to kicking out, to a different tool and then trying to translate it back into your context. So that's one limitation that dashboards have today that will be changed with BI. We will see fewer dashboards, which have more standardized use, if you will. And all of this free from discovery, one-time exploration will be driven through new modalities, like conversational interfaces, and it will be deeply embedded into the work environment that people are actually in. And the other part of dashboards, which is incredibly is limiting, and dashboards, try to be smart about it because they allow you to do drill downs and filtering and all of that sort of things. But the problem is you only see what you see, right? So that has two inherent challenges, right? What if the interesting stuff is hidden in big aggregates, in other dimensions, in something which is not visible to you, right? So what do you want to do? Do you want to create 100 charts? That's impractical. No one can consume that. No one can hold that state. So you do need an assistant which is able to look behind the charts, actually tell you which are the interesting ones to look at, which are the micro signals that you should be acting on. And maybe thirdly, I do think it's really interesting as well, is that dashboards are really made for humans to comprehend data, right? That's kind of the idea, right? Visual data discovery. Well, big question though is this really the end of data-driven insights? Because if you are thinking about now a system which is doing something in real time, basically adjusting as data signal changes, acting on data streams, triggering a action in a real business interaction, for instance, right? For instance, when you call a call center, right? And you talk about, the service issues that you are experiencing, right? For the service agent, basically surfacing all of the information about your history, the product, possible ways of resolving that, right? If you want to do something like that, dashboards are not the way to go, right? You need to have something which is acting on way smaller signals at a way higher frequency, and then basically becoming a proactive provider of insights rather than a reactive display of data. So I think those three areas tell us that dashboards are great. They got us this far, but I think the true promise of data is still way more, way bigger, and they'll be driven from other modalities.
Okay, this is fascinating. It seems like all three of those things you mentioned. So the first one was about having integration with the existing tools you're working with. The second one, I think, was just having insights pulled out automatically rather than you having to go and point and click and filter things or whatever. And the third one is really around like having real-time insights. So they're all about just you not having to look for data, but having the insights pushed to you. So I'd love to talk about this further. I guess let's take the one about integration with existing tools. How do you envisage a dashboard being integrated with, I guess, like email or Slack or I don't know, whatever your office tools are? How is that going to work?
Yeah, I think your question is already interesting, right? Because the question is, how do you integrate a dashboard? And probably the answer is, well, you won't, right? Why would you? The answer to that question is, what if that the data agent that I spoke about earlier, right? What if they have an API so they can be reached by a Slack or a Google Chat, and that you can basically in the context of a group chat that you're having or in the email chain that you're having, and then you are basically either looking for data, wondering about data, or like we said, basically getting supported with additional data through this agent in the medium that you're working in, right? Why wouldn't it be just a chat message? I just take my professional work experience, right? On operating services, product performance. It's much more natural for me actually to be in the meeting that you're having, in the chat group that you're having, and saying, hey, what did this actually look like last month, or how is this actually trending? And actually have then a specific factual answer for the given circumstance versus, okay, here is a link to a dashboard, click the link, okay, find all of the right filters, okay, setting all of the filters, right? All that takes already way too long for me to actually do this, and unless it's really, really important, right? And it makes it worth all of that effort. And so when I say meeting the people where they are, is bringing data and insights through new interfaces, new APIs. These APIs that are able to take questions, hold context, generate visualizations, and provide them back in the work medium that you are actually using.
Okay, that sounds very cool. And I like the idea. It's like, well, I suppose, of course, the answer to how do you integrate stuff is going to be APIs. But that's interesting that you're almost doing away with the dashboard. Then it's just like, these are specific insights that you asked for. And then that's going to be put in the place where you're working.
Yeah, and we will have some standardized dashboards that have like information which is required to be frequently looked at. There is a whole space of regulation and compliance. There is a whole space of enterprise standardization, right? That in businesses like in operating a service, you want that everyone is up to date, on a certain set of KPIs, every day. But the majority of dashboards today out there, they're not like that. These are these one-time discoveries, few-time discoveries, project. I had a question. And that creates, that proliferation of that, like thousands, tens of thousands of BI dashboards that are sitting stale. And I think the big opportunity space is actually transforming them into something which is actually a part of someone's workflow, and also doing away with dashboard as the vehicle of delivering it.
I can certainly see how dashboards is something useful if something like, hey, this is what our current company cash flow looks like. Management will want to look at that like most days, I think. But then, if it's more for exploratory data analysis then, or for a simple one-off analysis, then dashboards are going to disappear for that, you think? Yeah,
and the interesting part, which is, even when you see information, what does your mind, usually do? Why? Why is that, right? And why is it like this? And why is it not like that? And then you have these questions, why, or, what if, or, how would it look like, in that configuration, like the cash flow, right? Why is it trending like that? What has changed? And the opportunity is that you actually, you literally, you just, type, why is it like that? What has changed? And, you get, an answer, this is what's different. This is what has changed. And it sounds so natural, right? This is why we have, as kids, I don't know, we watched Knight Rider and, all of these shows, or Star Trek right there. People always had that intuition. It would be so great if I could just talk to a computer. It would understand what I want. It has all the right context. And it just can help me with progressing with my task, right? Because they're not an end in itself. They're means to an end. And the best way of how we could facilitate that so far was dashboards and long change requests with analysts. And now AI is giving us this whole new capability set, right? Of we actually, can know people. You just write in chat, why? And you're going to get all of these insights, that are lurking in your data that were unearthed before.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, Knight Rider was around in the 80s. Like, why don't we have Kit yet?
Well, maybe we will, maybe.
Yeah, maybe we will. Okay, so I'm curious as to if this is these changes are having an effect on things. Well, I mean, obviously at Google you have Looker. So is Looker changing to accommodate sort of new ways of thinking about dashboards?
Yes, this is the main area of our work, actually. So basically our work in Looker exactly falls into the same two categories where we started. On the one side, we're introducing Gen AI and Looker to help the data professional, working in Looker. We help them with creating content, writing LookML code, helping to reasoning about the system, helping them to generate slides, all of the typical tasks or, jobs, that data professionals have on a daily basis. And we think about ways, okay, how can we use now AI as another way of making that task better? No different from how technology develops. It's all about making it simpler, making it faster, making it more accessible so people, can get their jobs done. And on the other side, on the Looker side, which, is the part that I was speaking about last, is how can we actually make it so that Looker allows you to basically talk to your enterprise data? It's kind of like this, a good test question is, in any audience, how many of them use Google? And, usually everyone does, so everyone knows how to use it, how to use a search engine. That's what I mean, right? It's so natural, that, from children to grandparents, no issue in Googling. Every person I know, in a professional context knows how to use a search engine. When you ask the same question about a BI tool, you get a very different answer, right? This is very hard. And oh my God, I have to understand data. And I remember distinctly early in my career, we did a survey about why people don't use more data. And, one of the biggest points was they're genuinely insecure. It seems so technical. This is hard stuff. Do I get it wrong? There are so many hurdles in the way. And, so what if, we can make BI as easy as searching a search engine? Why wouldn't it be, right? Why shouldn't it be? And the interesting piece is that this is technically very, very hard. So this is, it sounds so simple, but it's incredibly tough problem to solve for. And what we have, our approach, Google's approach is that we, take a set of steps, to solve that problem. Because the key with BI is once you give someone that tool, it needs to be 100% correct. There is no space for, hey, I might get it right 80% of the time, because how could you trust in that, to take any sort of decision? And the whole point of data is that you help people, reasoning and come to conclusions and come to decisions. So there is a whole space of building specialized AI models, who are specializing at the task. There's a whole space of understanding a data system and how it works, and basically building a knowledge graph of data to grounded in the factuality of an enterprise context. And then there is, because you asked for Looker specifically, there is like the last element is giving data strong semantics, way richer than the semantics that we would have like in a database schema. It's way more sophisticated than that. And it's actually semantics for an AI model to reason with. And then exposing then this semantic model with the right set of APIs. So an agent can now, or multiple agents can now start and to operate on that. And those are the two threats we have in Looker, right? So one is help the data professionals, in their jobs, and giving them this new way of exposing data to virtually anyone in their companies to freely explore it by using their own language, their native tools, and stay in their workflows.
Okay, so that's interesting with the two different audiences then, because like maybe you're a data analyst, you just want to build your dashboards faster, at least for the future. And then for everyone else in the organization, you want to be able to understand the data and sort of consume more of it more easily. So I guess the second one is perhaps the bigger audience then. And you mentioned the idea that a lot of people just feel insecure about working with data, about understanding with it. Can you have like a purely technical solution to that, or are there other things that organizations need to do to help people feel more confident with data?
Yeah, as always, right? The cultural change always is bigger than the technology change. I do think there's one thing that helps us, like we joked about, Kid and Star Trek, right? I think there is a human intuition that this is, how it should work. So, everyone knows that idea and it comes natural. So I think, in general, people are ready and prepared for it, to interact with a system like this. And the second piece is that I think it's always the same, right? Technology develops, from the primitive over the complex to the simple. And I think that's like Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, I think, who said that, originally. And I think this is exactly what we see today, right? Data used to be primitive, it used to be expert systems handled by a few people and very limited. We are now in the complexity stage where you have like a million tools, dashboards. Everyone, that was the big contradiction of self-service BI. Everyone should self-serve, but it meant everyone should be really becoming a data expert here, which of course is not viable. And now with generative AI, we approach the simple stage where actually people can experience it, and through the experience with it, they will see the benefits and use it, and that will develop, that fast adoption cycle that we have seen also with Gen AI all along, right? That basically through experience and through recognizing the value it generates, there is a big problem that people want to solve, and if basically they can experience the solution, I don't think there is any other barrier than just if you will, the ability for organizations now to shift their focus on how they think BI, how they think data, and the role of generative AI in it.
It's a very sort of compelling vision, but as you mentioned, the idea of self-service analytics, self-service BI has been around for a long time. We still not quite get there. So do you have any sense of like how you would go about trying to get closer to self-service BI across your organization?
Yes, what in Looker, we are providing these, new agentic experiences and APIs. And their whole point is actually that now a data professional, they can, build a data agent, to basically, in their stead, handle a task, for a set of problems. And it's even my experience, right? I am fortunate, right? We have an analyst team that I can ask questions. But I ask a lot of questions because I'm very curious, right? I always want to know more. So what they have done is basically they built that agent for me, and what now their part was is making sure it does the job. It answers the question what they want me or wanted to answer. They gave it all of the guardrails, and now I can interact with the system. And the great thing is, I can do it all day long. I can ask a million times why. I'm not ashamed. Say I didn't get that. Can like that maybe. Can you show it to me like that? And that's such a big unlock. And I think, like you said, the job of getting insights is as old as the first decision systems, right? Maybe as old as business, or maybe as old as humankind. I don't know. The desire to reason better, to understand more. That persists. And I think now the opportunity is that, actually now many people can, that, beforehand didn't have an analyst or didn't want to send them like not a million, but, like 10 questions, rapid fire one after the other. And organizations who also, had to basically not the ability to invest in a data function like that before. And, just a few analysts, right, which really want to solve complex problems, right, are basically drowning in business requests to support dashboarding. This is the demand that I think is exists, that is unfulfilled by self-serve BI, and we now have a technical solution that actually can meet the job that people actually want to do in a much better way.
Okay, yeah. So just cutting out that sort of middleman of the data for at least some of the questions, maybe the easier questions, and then you can gradually sort of build out that sort of broader BI self-service capability. Okay. As well as talking about dashboards and BI, I'd also like to talk about the more technical side of thing. So particularly with databases, because that's obviously it's a huge part of any data function within any organization. And SQL code generation is becoming popular in a lot of databases. So can you tell me how this works within the Google databases? And I know you've got a lot of databases.
SQL code generation is extraordinarily hard. And one reason is that, you're not just generating code, you're also mapping to a schema, right? So, there's like two pieces to the puzzle, if you will. And, schemas are usually proprietary. They don't exist, in the training data of large language models. So there are some really interesting challenges in the generation of SQL code itself. Also, data systems, tend to be very big, right? So, when we talk about context, it's much more complex than, the BI problem, if you will. But on the other hand, there's also big opportunity. And this is, once you're talking, in the database context, you're actually working with a data professional who understands code. Basically the persona does change. In the BI part, the challenge really is finding the right modality, for a business user. In the space that we are now in, right, we have a technical savvy person who can understand the output of, code generation, for instance, and the challenge much more becomes in how do I actually, make this productive and useful in a big query, tens of thousands of tables, in a single instance or single customer. How do I actually make it work in that context? And the answer to this is there is a whole new category of how we build data systems. For instance, one part, that we all know what makes generative AI models good is having the right context. So one word I mentioned earlier was the knowledge graph of data, right? You actually have to understand what does the data landscape looks like? What is a person looking at? What is their permission? What are other people's with their permission looking at? What has been looked at, by people like them in the same period of time? What has been used recently? What has changed recently, right? So basically, you suddenly need to think about your metadata system much more differently. And you basically consider it, basically all your metadata becomes one huge search index, that you're basically querying for context all the time when a data professional is generating code. That's actually where a whole lot of the art, actually resides in. It's also, why, when you look at all of these big benchmarks, like, BERT SQL or many public benchmarks of generating SQL code, you basically see it, tapping out like 60-70% of accuracy, something like that, right? And the key is a big part of the key is actually setting the right context without someone explicitly specifying the context, just by the use and the metadata and the knowledge of the system that you have. So that's one big bucket. And the other big bucket is, we talked, I said, earlier, it's, reductionist to think, everything is on autopilot. It's also reductionist, to think there is just one model instance, doing all of the jobs, right? So, what, we are working on the Google side is actually building task-specific models who understand domains really well. And within that domain, you actually know, right, what is the relevant context that you're working with. The model, for instance, for using building data pipelines, wrangling data is different from analyzing data. And the model for basically doing drill downs and finding for interesting subqueries is yet another model again, right? So there is also a whole part of actually engineering the system. So you have a multitude of models who are then plugging into the data scientist or data engineer or SQL analyst tool chain. And thirdly, it's also about changing the user experience. So what today, most data systems look like is, one SQL console, right? So that's, how I, probably, what all people have grown up with, or what I grew up with, is left side, some sort of data set explorer or schema explorer, or right side, one, bright or black, window for writing SQL code, or maybe an Emacs OVI, but same idea. That is, inherently difficult, right? Because on the one side, all of the information about context and state is in this different pane. And then where we write our code, we have basically nothing that now a Gen AI model can work with or reason about than just, the code we write or generate. So one of the big changes that we are introducing on our side is actually thinking through how would a user experience look like if it would be designed AI first. And one of the experiences I think we've just created, just last week actually, is Data Canvas. And Data Canvas is now basically saying that, well, if you have an AI agent, you would actually start the flow and the creation process different, right? You would more work in data frames. And you would actually not only work in data frames, you would work in association of data frames. And if you do that, right, the model understands the structure and the relationship of your, train of thought. It's not just, reliant on the schema information that you have broadly available in the database catalog. And, you would not interface with it just via a chat side panel. You would basically have it continuously working with you, basically in every single data frame that you build, and start, to give you more recommendations, more generations based on the graph that you're building up yourself, essentially, right? And so it's though, in summary, those three things, right? One is understanding a knowledge graph of data and building it. The second one is that understanding of having a family of models that are highly specialized to basically plug into the data professional tasks. And thirdly, rethinking also the user interfaces and the experiences the data professionals work in to make them designed for high quality AI generation. Because you can help AI, we all know this, right? So funny, right? Everything is in the prompt, right? So, like in the good old days, the secret is asking the right question. You're a podcaster, you know that. And it turns out that, we can, of course, make it the user's problem of writing the perfect prompt, right? Use this table and then do that, and then, pull it from here. And, basically we make the prompt like an essay. Or we actually build experiences that build up the prompt continuously and retrieve the right context continuously as you're working. And basically make it part of the tool. And that makes the data professional AI experience really work at the end.
Okay, I have to say that last point sounds especially useful because certainly, at least when these sort of chat tools first came out, it's like, okay, you generate me some SQL, and you're basically writing almost exactly what the SQL should be. Like, well, take these particular columns from this table. And it's like, well, you've not actually done much. I might as well just write the SQL at that point. So yeah, having the sort of automation done so you can really just stick to simpler language and not have to write an essay in your prompt does sound incredibly useful. I'm curious because you mentioned context is the important thing to getting this right. Do organizations need to provide some of this context? Like, what do you need to do so the AI understands about your data?
You're cutting, I think, to the core of maybe not the issue, the core of the opportunity, rather. And I actually think you can't think of your AI system and your data system differently. Because what you have just described, Richie, I think your experience with using SQL code generation basically shows the key constraint of a large language model is it's probabilistic, right? It doesn't. There is no factual knowledge, right? It basically operates on token by token probabilities, and then it converges, it regresses, it's auto-regressive towards a final output, right? So if it doesn't know your schema, right, if there is no probability of using the right columns because it didn't exist in the training set, it won't know, right? If you're using syntax or stored procedure functions or anything like that, right, or libraries, not in SQL but in Python, it won't know that. So a big part is actually understanding that when we build these AI capabilities, they are closely intertwined with the data system. For instance, they need to have an ability to fact check themselves against your data schema. And that's more than a prompt, right? Because the prompt basically says, I would like you to do this. Then the model basically probabilistically does something. And then, at the end, actually you do have to, go through and saying, are these the right columns? If not, which are the ones that, actually would be the right ones? Is this the right function? Is there maybe a function that, would do this better? So basically you start thinking in what I called earlier, this ensemble of agents. And they all need to work together to actually get to high quality SQL generation. Because at the end, like you said, right, you want it to just get it, get the right data, get the right functions, get the right syntax. So it actually does help you. So that is a huge part of when I say context. It's actually not just generating the right prompt, but thinking of AI as a system that closely interfaces with your data system. And I think that's one of the key issues actually, that right now everyone tries to AIify everything, obviously, and you see that people are trying to stitch together, right? I take my AI model from here and I take my data system from there, and then I just build a prompt and it's all gonna work. And the answer is no, it won't, because the reality is much more complex than that. And so a big part is understanding AI and data as part of of a platform, working together. And the more you can specialize this together, the higher quality the output will be. Now, the problem is, of course, if you are a vendor selling data warehouses and you are not having any roots in AI, you see it playing out in market, right? You acquire, you hire, you try to build that gap, but it's going to take you what? Years, 5 years, 7 years, and I think that's just data thinking, right? So you want to choose a platform which is data and AI first.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people think, well, AI is getting smarter. We're gonna have like one super powerful AI that does everything, but actually, the reality is you end up with having lots of smaller AIs working together. You mentioned the term ensemble, so it's lots of different smaller AIs playing together. So the SQL example is like one thing, sort of figuring out like, how do I write the SQL? Another one's like checking, does this match the schema and things like that. So it's more narrowly focused.
Tricky territory, because as we know, when you look at any of the large benchmarks, large models beat small models, even specialized ones. So they're the professor model, if you will, right? Gemini, the large models, they tend, to do well across all sorts of tasks, even better in tasks than smaller specialized models. So when I say ensemble of models, I don't necessarily mean not using big models and many small models instead. What I mean is, when we think about a model acting like an agent, basically we want to give them focus on a specific task, and this is the craft of AI, if you will. For instance, SQL generation works better if you ask the model twice. If you ask it once, what is the logical plan? Think about a logical plan. And then, once you have the logical plan, translate it into SQL. Basically we ask the same model to play two roles. One is do the abstract reasoning and then do the code translation. And then I think, it's natural, like divide and conquer, that principle in computer science, right? Decompose a problem into smaller problems. And that's what we are seeing here as well, right? We are basically building an AI system where multiple agents collaborate with each other in this ensemble. But I think still it's an ensemble of large models, right? We are not at a state where we have any evidence that super small, highly specialized models can outperform large models.
Okay, so it's more task deconstruction than necessarily like picking lots of different types of AI things.
And maybe fine tune them specifically to a task and align them to a specific task. But not really. I don't think. I certainly don't believe that you can just distill a bunch of small models and can expect the same performance as you get from large, powerful models, like the Gemini model family. And we are specializing in using a Gemini model family specifically and basically building an ensemble with it.
So you mentioned that you shouldn't think of what you're doing with your data platform and your AI platform separately. Everything needs to be integrated. But I think the reality is many businesses at this point, they're using dozens, maybe hundreds of different like data and AI tools, and there's more and more tools come out all the time. Is there a secret to getting all the different tools you're working with play nicely together?
I actually think, having many tools is fine. A practical example is, in BigQuery, people use a large set of tools against it in one customer even, right? And it works because they're all sharing the same data. They're all, there is basically, the tool is more of a form factor of how does someone want to consume. It doesn't change the meaning, semantics, any of that, right? It doesn't, if you will, basically that proliferation is basically making it more consumable. It's not really a problem by itself. It may be a cost concern and people would like to just buy one license, eventually, but it is not, I think, the big issue of standardization. I think the standardization issue comes in when you use multiple platforms. I think there is a big distinction between platform and tool. The same basically applies with models, right? Is there an issue with using many models? No, definitely not. Does it mean you should use multiple platforms? Probably not, right? Not a great idea. One of the reasons, why in Vertex AI we have that model garden, which gives you access to over 100 model plus Hugging Face, is because depending on the use case, depending on the scenario, you will need to choose, right? And you have different cost considerations, latency considerations, whatever it may be, right? But the platform aspects of governing, building, lifecycle, deploying, models, this is basically what a platform guarantees. In the data space, it would be security, correctness, semantics, lineage, all of these aspects, to also be part of one governed platform. In the data space, there was this terrific, phase when we talked about data meshes. And, everyone loved that idea of data mesh, right? Because again, it sounds so promising. And what though was a bit unfortunate, many people then basically took all of the issues which they had, all of their, many data platforms which duplicated data, inconsistent governance, and so forth, and just said, it's great, we just call it a mesh. We are done here, right? We just modernized our data architecture. But data mesh, specifically was specific about one point, that shared infrastructure component, right, on which all of these data products are then being built. And what I say platform is that shared data foundation. And I think the key to being successful with data is understanding the very essence of data-driven value generation, which is, very simply put, the more data signals you can bring together, the more you find hidden or latent, unintuitive patterns in your data, the more you can build services or models using that data, the more customer value or customer services you can create, which generate more data for you, for which you gather more data signals, allowing you to build better services and models, generating more data. That's the flywheel of data, right? That's the basic idea. And that is built on the premise that you can build these not big, but very wide data records, bringing many data signals together, because this is actually where the interesting patterns that you want to leverage in data are being exposed. They're not in the data slices in silos that you have in an application. For instance, in business system, right? You want to know your HR data and your service performance, for instance, coming together, right? Or you want that your supply chain and your front order deliveries coming together, right? You want all of this together. And that tells you that by definition, you need to have the shared data foundation. This is the very foundation on which data-driven value generation is being built on at scale. And the key, history of Google was, right? Google basically is a data-driven business, right? In the purest definition, maybe, or in the core of the definition, was looking at the data technology market and saying, hey, we want to build this data system that basically gives us this property of building these wide data records that allow us to harness all of the data signal, and couldn't find any solution in the technology market. So Google built its own. And as it so happened, now we call it BigQuery. But BigQuery beforehand Dremel, and that idea of this query engine and the storage model behind it that can be used to make these immensely big data sets and analyze them is basically what is designed to build that common data foundation. And my point would be, if you build that common data foundation, don't sweat the tools as much. It's maybe something you want to optimize, but it's not the big leverage. The big leverage truly is in having that wide data record foundation that allows you to capture all data signals and bring them in a common platform where you can associate them with each other. So you do see these latent patterns, meaning the hidden patterns that your data already has, but you only will see, right, if you bring it together. This is why I also think, the big data age is finally coming to an end, because it's not about big data. It's about wide data. I think it's a way better way of thinking about it.
A lot covered there, but it sounds like what you're saying, particularly for the lower level, the data infrastructure, you want that to be common across your whole organization, because you don't want different teams to have to worry about data security or things like that. It should just be standard throughout the company. But then I guess as you get closer to the business use cases, that's where you want a bit more tailoring, so you can really focus on, well, this is how we add business value with our models and data products and things like that.
Yeah, and you want this data foundation to grow, right? If someone brings in your data, you don't want this to be an island of its own, right? You want to associate with all of your other data. When you have the ability, right, your customer data, your sales data, your service data, the social media data, all of that stuff, and you see that wide data record, right? That is the true definition of a customer 360, right? It's not, doing a CRM query and knowing what they have ordered. It's basically seeing all of that in conjunction, and that allows then, this allows, the creation of new and exciting services, for instance, or making processes much more efficient, because you find now these relationships that you couldn't see before. And that emergent, record of making it ever growing and bigger, I call it the flywheel, right, of data. That only works if you basically build that common foundation. If basically everyone builds their own, you have many small flywheels, but you don't get that momentum and compound effect of what your enterprise data actually has. And organizations need to bring it together to unlock it.
Absolutely. I'm sure in every single organization, basically no one knows the extent of what all the data is there. I mean, I know we have vast amounts of data at DataCamp. I know quite a lot of it, but I'm sure there are huge pockets of data I have no idea about. And so, yeah, having access to those is going to give you ideas for things you can build that you wouldn't understand otherwise. So I think it feels like this goes beyond tooling though, right? Because you can buy these shiny new tools, but getting to business success, there's another step there. Do you want to talk me through that, what that looks like?
Yeah, business success, I think there are three very concrete ways. And, as I said, right, data is no end in itself, right? So you want to use data to make existing processes more efficient. And, that is something that businesses are really good at measuring, right? How, one space is in the efficiency side, right? How much better am I in managing business metrics like service requests in SLO, day sales outstanding. And data, is a huge accelerant to that, right? Giving either people the right information to complete their tasks or creating new self-service offerings, right? That's a huge space, right? How many service center calls can a company prevent by, for instance, giving them, a chat agent that is able to understand, what they're trying to do and help them all along. So that's the efficiency space is one big one. I think, a more interesting one is in the, let's call it, in the new feature, new capability space. How can you use your data to augment your existing products? For instance, I'm wearing a Garmin watch here, no advertising. The reason why I'm wearing this watch is because of all of the value add, the data signals are giving me. And Garmin basically convinced me from saying, hey, this is not a great looking watch, I'm not sure if I want to wear it, to saying that I want to wear this every day, because it basically tells me so much about, my well-being, my sleep, how it's trending, if I, should sleep more, if I should work out, right? And these are all, these are new services. So when you think about, your favorite streaming platform, right? The quality of the recommendations, for instance, or the ability to take usage data and create new content. This is a way of using data to build new products, and that should result in engagement and revenue. These are really hard and tangible business metrics. And I think there is even the third space of, what you can call new companies. How many companies are built on their ability to understand and match data? So many come to mind, right? From ride sharing, to hospitality. So many great examples where it's really a data platform, that basically creates the product in itself. So I think there are some real hard business metrics that any company can associate back to their data initiatives. And then there's the fourth one. It's a bit of a harder to quantify one, because how do you quantify the ability of people to make fast and confident decisions? Non-trivial to measure. But ultimately, right, what Google search is doing, right? It's helping, billions of people getting to the answers which they want. And it's so quick, and then just imagine not having it. Would create a huge problem, for me, if I'm looking for something to buy or looking for something to read. And the same applies, if we do BI well, to how people work every day, right? And it's not, as easily captured as in this one business metric, because it will make workflow faster. It will make, customers more happy and employees more engaged and feel more productive. But that's much more of an ambient quality. And I think it is an equally important one, though harder to measure.
Absolutely. Again, just perhaps that last one's the biggest one, just making people make decisions or helping people make decisions faster. That's probably going to add vast amounts of value in there for any organization and just all the individuals within it. Okay, so we talked about dashboards, we talked about databases, we talked about getting value from your data. Are there any other data trends that you're most excited about at the moment?
Oh, Richie, it's really the most exciting time in data right now with the opportunity space that generative AI creates. There is one sub-trend, if you will, that I am mostly excited about. It's interesting. We have two big gaps. The one gap we talked about, right? People have not the access to information that they could have, and we talked about how this is going to change. The other side is there is so much data which is not being used. How much knowledge and wisdom is locked away in all the documents, video, audio recordings that exist. Unstructured data is by far the largest data type that exists. And it's the one that's hardly ever used in any enterprise data landscape. And the reason is it's just too darn hard. It's very specialized if you build an unstructured data processing pipeline. It's very difficult. It's not like a table that you can query this way and that way and join it, but it should be. why can't it be? And generative AI gives us, for the first time, a way to reason about unstructured data in a fairly flexible way. And when I think about the opportunities that we have by just harnessing that data, how much richer that will make any company in their ability to capitalize on data, I do think it's going to be maybe the biggest step change in all of this, because the data's there, everyone has it, and now basically we got the key, the key to the safe, which is called generative AI, and I think it will unlock a whole set of new use cases and improvements that basically everyone can tap into now. That really excites me.
That's a very good point, that there is a vast amount of just really useful information just stored away in documents and videos and things that no one really has access to. I'm sure there are many Google Docs in our organization that it's like, I'm sure it says something useful, but I don't know where it is or what it says. So yeah, being able to access that and get some value out of it sounds incredibly important. All right, super. Thank you so much, Gerrit, for your time.
Thank you, Richie. It was great being here today.